Thank you. So we're getting our mics all set up, and I'll let them do that. I just want to thank Melanie for following up on this conversation that we started up in Hanover, New Hampshire last year in April. And it was really kind of an outgrowth of the book that we edited together, Food Across Borders, which is another way of saying buy the book. It's a great book. And there's some really great work really about more milk production, but we thought we should get into the issue of meat consumption. So as it's been already made clear, this conference is a follow-up on that two-day conference. The name of that conference was Cows, Land, and Labor, and it explored the consequences and challenges of livestock, especially bovine agriculture in the United States and beyond. Among the many panels we hosted, one of them focused on soil and climate that included Jeff Creque. In addition to Jeff, we had the Vermont State climatologist, a soil biologist, and a nutrition scientist who participated in the conversation. I think the configuration today is quite different and complementary with Avery and with Sara. And so I'm really excited to have a kind of different, and I think much more sort of public-facing type of engagement about this issue of meat and climate. So in Hanover, the discussion was framed around some very general questions about grazing practices. And they were, what are the benefits and possibilities of bovine agriculture to planetary health? And how does pasture management by farmers contribute to the overall effort to draw down carbon dioxide into our soils? I came at this issue not really from a scholarly perspective, not at all, in fact. Since moving to the Upper Valley, I had become a farmer. And so I raise grass-fed beef. I also raise mostly lamb these days. And I've also raised pork as well, so raising pigs. And I've tried to really engage the community of farmers up there that are very committed to regenerative agriculture. Notably, Nico Horster, who runs Shire Beef and sells his beef throughout the region. So it's a really important part of agriculture in the Upper Valley, and we're doing our part. So as a layman, or if you want to say a farmer, my takeaways from our first panel up there in Hanover, and really Jeff's presentation, was this. Grazing produces disturbance, okay? And that's essentially what we were talking about today in the morning. So the question of what kind of disturbance is really the key question, okay? If we're going to be engaged in agriculture and livestock agriculture, there's going to be disturbance of the land and of the environment. So that's really what we want to talk about today, is how much carbon we can capture in terms of the kind of livestock agriculture that we're doing. And will that offset that carbon in such a way that livestock agriculture is something we should do more of, less of? These were some of the questions that we engaged in the first panel. From Jeff's presentation, I learned that this question of carbon capture is dependent on space, time, magnitude, and frequency of that disturbance. In other words, how many cows graze the land, for how long, and how frequently do they return to that land after grazing it the first time? The other takeaway that I had from our conference is that we cannot appreciate the impact of livestock grazing unless we consider the effect from not just above the atmosphere, but the below, the soil. In other words, the effects of regenerative agriculture are often best measured in the increased productivity in the soil. And we heard that this morning and debated it this morning, right? So I want to begin by asking Jeff to not do the whole 20-minute presentation with which we started our conference, but to get into the concept of positive and negative feedback and how that determines what is regenerative farming and what is not regenerative farming. So,
yeah.
Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. I think the fundamental question is, what is the system we're talking about? And at what scale do we need to examine these questions? So the debate this morning to me was really a conflict of scales. On the one hand, you've got the local agricultural perspective talking about how to manage an agricultural ecosystem. And on the other hand, we have this unfolding global catastrophe that's evoking high-level responses, but within, I think, the paradigm that actually created the problem. So we're I think, at a really critical junction here, where we need a paradigm shift. We need to think differently about the way we look at this global ecosystem that we are now literally driving, right? Our behavior is determining what's happening at the global scale. So at the local scale, we can talk about managing a herd of animals to achieve specific ecological objectives. At the global scale, that kind of becomes almost unmanageable because we have so many different ecologies with livestock agriculture. And yet if we really step back and we say, well, what is the role of large grazing animals within our global ecosystem? Because we've had large grazing animals in our ecosystem for millennia, right? Doing very interesting things. So without belaboring this too long, I want to just refer to a paper that McNaughton wrote in 1979, when she was looking at the dynamics of the Serengeti. And he talked about grazing as an optimization strategy. Optimization of what? What are we optimizing? What it comes down to is optimizing our capture of solar energy for the use of the construction of our bodies and our civilization. And it's nexus between our global climate crisis, which is fundamentally an energy crisis fueled by our inappropriate use of deeply sequestered fossil carbon, and transferring that to the atmosphere, driving the total destabilization of our global climate system. This is the crisis we face. Is there a role for ruminant livestock or livestock at all in addressing that problem? And I would say very definitely there's a role for that, for livestock, in helping us address this crisis. And it does come down to scale. Right. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, so this issue of scale, I think we are all engaged in different ways, and I want to start there, because I think that was, in some ways, where the rubber hit the road in that first panel, and there was a lot of debate about that. So there was the mention of the white oak pasture study. That was on neither Nicolette or is it Timothy mentioned how big that farm was. It's 3,000 acres, right? Most confined feedlots are 12,000 or bigger, right? So at what scale do we have diminishing returns on the kind of regenerative agriculture that we're talking about? Does anybody want to take that up? Is there a point at which what we're talking about is impossible if we're trying to sequester carbon and make livestock agriculture a part of the solution?
Well, I'll just start talking. So my name is Sara. I'm with Bolingo Animal Health. I'm actually from a dairy farm about 3-4 hours north of here originally. So all my family is in production agriculture, so I just put that out as a disclaimer of like that's my frame of reference that I'm coming at a lot of this from, and in my bias that I think ruminants are awesome, right? So I just put that disclaimer out there. And I think your point about scales is really important in terms of like what are the questions that we're asking, what's feasible, and maybe I won't answer your question perfectly, but I think it's almost just taking a step back and thinking about why does our agricultural system look the way it does? Like what are the main objectives and the things that we're valuing now? And obviously it is centered around feeding people. It is a transformation of solar energy into these different forms that we find desirable, right? And that's partially why our system looks the way it does, right? There's policy that influences it. There's all sorts of things that influence it. But in terms of how it's going to look in the future, I think demand was brought up, and like it's going to be an economic question in large part, right? Because if there isn't this system to support some of the transformation to different production systems, then that's not gonna happen, right? And I think there's sometimes and that piece of this doesn't come out very much in terms of just the realities of. At the end of the day, the current trends are we still value mostly having cheap and affordable and abundant, safe food. Those are high priorities in our food system. It seems that way from the standpoint of what we reward economically and from a policy standpoint. And so I think to change some of those things or to add in different things, there's lots of different angles to go at it. I think maybe actually value some of these other ecosystem services that are currently just free almost, right? And I think that's part of the challenge is like when we think about grazing systems, there's different efforts there now, ecosystem markets that are trying to get up off the ground. That's part of the challenge. If you're not paying for water purification or for other things that grazing lands are providing currently, why would you start paying for it? Yeah, so that's part of the externalities discussion that doesn't get discussed very much. Is there's positive externalities too that aren't being accounted for, right? That we're not talking about.
So
Can I pick up on that? I think that's a great point. Thanks. And by way of introduction, my name is Avery Cohn. I'm based at ClimateWorks, a foundation working to end the climate crisis in a way that's good for all of us. I have a PhD focused in land systems, and so I come at this with a bias too, where I think about the land and how we use it, and making sure that we're balancing, our aims to have a healthy food system, a healthy environment, and a robust economy. And I think Sara nailed it. When I think about scale, I think about things in a really simple way. What is it that we get out of the land use that we do, and is it valuable for us? What are the environmental benefits and costs? What are the health benefits and costs? Many of those have to do with food. Many of them have to do with local environmental services. And every piece of land that we use, we should be asking, what did we put into it? What did we get out of it? And we should be working towards using land in ways where we're getting more out of it than we put into it, accounting for those environmental services, accounting for the local environmental pollution that happens when we use land poorly, accounting for climate emissions, accounting for our food security, and accounting for heart disease and these other diseases associated with an unhealthy food system.
So Avery, you've done a lot of work in terms of striving for goals that are out there in 2050. We had some conversation about this before the panel. Could you just articulate why 2050 is a very important date and where we are now and where we want to be in 2050?
Sure. So, the climate question is a question about how to have a safe, livable climate, and we don't have that now. We're on a trajectory that is unsafe and could lead to an existential threat to the way that we live our lives in many places around the world. As a climate community, we set targets, and those targets look out into the future. 2050 is important, and so too is 2025 and 2030. We got to get there. The 2050 number is in the developed world. We need to reduce our emissions by on the order of 90%. And so you heard in the earlier panel that food and agriculture are associated with about a quarter of all of our emissions. That means that there's going to be very little room to emit much of anything from any sector, including food and agriculture. We need to get much more efficient and quickly. And as we do that, we need to also contemplate the challenge that populations are growing, affluence is rising globally, and this leads to more consumption of everything. That's important, that's actually good, but as it happens, we need to get more efficient, and we also need to cut out of our consumption things that are high emitting.
So Jeff, at the Carbon Cycle Institute, what are you advocating through that organization in terms of meeting some of the goals that Avery has just articulated?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with everything Avery said. The point perhaps of departure is the focus on emissions from agriculture. Agriculture has significant emissions, no question, and many of them are unnecessary and can be eliminated relatively easily. But our focus at the Carbon Cycle Institute is actually on engaging that excess CO2 in the atmosphere and through agricultural practices transforming it into soil carbon primarily and biomass, the production of agriculture, which is simply a question of how do we farm, and it comes down to how do we farm. And is our agricultural practices resulting in capture of more carbon from the atmosphere than we are emitting, or carbon dioxide equivalents, if you will, so that we can address issues like nitrous oxide and methane as well. And what we're seeing, and there's abundant science out there to support this, is that we can, in fact, do exactly that. And again, it comes down to the scale at which we affect our agricultural practices and the degree of care we exercise and how we manage our lands. Again, recognizing this intimate connection between the capture of solar energy and the photosynthetic transformation of atmospheric carbon dioxide into plant biomass, into primary production, which then evolves out into livestock production, soil organic matter increases, water quality enhancement, all of these cascading benefits or ecosystem services that are directly related to the nexus between solar energy, atmospheric CO2, and agriculture.
So Sara, I see you nodding your head, and I know that you work with a lot of the beef industry, and can you talk about exactly from a kind of industry point of view, these practices and these goals are being taken up and addressed, and are they up to the challenge?
Yeah, so I think sometimes we talk about these things like we put these arguments in these boxes and we expect them to respect those boundaries, and I don't think they do, right? In terms of, it's conventional or it's regenerative or, it's large scale or small scale, and I think we're missing a lot of what's happening on the ground in terms of there are people that practice regenerative practices that sell their weaned calves into the commodity market, and you may buy it at Walmart, right? I mean, it's not all clean cut, right, from that perspective. And I think this question of scale, if you want to make a bigger impact, you have to think about impacting the larger scale of agriculture, right? And we can make incremental changes on a larger base, right? That's going to scale up to a really big change, right? Hopefully that makes sense. And we have that reality that 85% of Americans live in suburban or urban areas, right? So that's why we do have large scale. People don't like them, like CAFOs and things like that, because again, it comes back to what we've prioritized, right? Cheap, affordable, abundant, readily supplied food, and that's why some of these systems have developed. These producers are responding to the market signals that are there. That said, in the last 6 months, I've had some trips where I've gone out to parts of like the Ogallala Aquifer area, right, in the high plains. It's where a lot of the cattle feeding is in the United States. So that parts of like western Texas, western Kansas, eastern Oklahoma, or eastern Colorado, where I'm at. And there's a lot of feed yards, large-scale feed yards that are actually thinking about, reality check that, obviously the water use in that area is by definition unsustainable, right? So what are the other things that we can do to conserve water, right? So there's some folks looking at taking out corn in terms of corn grain, just because that's a lot of water use. Can we use more forage crops, reduce water use, grow what we call stocker cattle, the yearling cattle to a heavier weight, bring them into a feed yard a little heavier and have a shorter amount of time in the feed yard, right? So we still have that efficiency of the feed yard, but we're shortening the time, right, that they're actually there, and we're adding more body weight gain on grass, right, on forage. So that's just one example where it's like it doesn't fit sometimes in these cookie cutter, right, different ways that we put it in. I think there's lots of flexibility in terms of thinking about our systems and those kind of tweaks that we can make. And I think part of driving that change is thinking about what are people that are on the ground, that are within the agricultural system, what drives their decision making, right? I think that's what you have to think about of what are those economic factors, what are the market realities, but what are the gaps that they have for making a leap to do something maybe different, right?
I'd like to weigh in on this one. Sure. So I think business plays a crucial role in this solution. And I agree with Sara's point about scale. When it comes to climate and business, it's really important that we, as a society, set expectations for businesses and set regulations for businesses so that they understand how to meet the climate challenge. And so far in food and agriculture, we're not doing enough with that. So in the energy space, we're doing a little bit better so far. And what that looks like is setting expectations for big energy companies like oil companies, saying, you can't value your unextracted oil reserves at the same level you were valuing them before, because it's likely that there's going to be a price on carbon in the future, and those assets aren't as valuable as you're saying. You need to invest in alternatives. You need to both make your existing ways of producing energy more efficient, and you need to be innovative. And you also need to stop blocking climate policy through advocacy groups. And if you do all three of those things, if you're innovative, efficient, and also not working at cross purposes with climate progress, we investment groups will reward you with a rating that says that you're a good corporate citizen. In the food and agriculture space, we're at a much earlier stage in terms of setting those sorts of expectations, saying what are the things that we expect of an agribusiness as we transition from the food system of today to the food system we need, and kind of baking those expectations in, saying we, all of us who have some amount of money in retirement plans and put some of that money into the public markets, the stocks of agribusinesses, we don't want to lose that money because you're ignoring that the climate's changing and the water in the Ogallala aquifer is drying up. We don't want to lose that money because you're ignoring the fact that your operation is emissions intensive, and in a future where we regulate those emissions, the value of your business is going to decline. You need to get smarter. But we as a society, from government to civil society groups to investment groups, need to send those signals that this is what we need businesses to do to innovate. And that can really accelerate the kind of action.
So one of the objectives of this panel, we talked about it, is to give the audience takeaways, like literally policy ideas or practices in the private sector. I'm glad that we're talking about private versus public here a bit. So on that issue then, and I want to maybe go back to you, Avery. One of the things you're talking about is adjusting through private enterprise and making the case through to the industry that they need to do things differently. It's in their economic interest. What then are we essentially living with or accepting that we're not going to mitigate growing demand? We're going to live with it and live within those parameters, or should we mitigate demand as was debated in the last panel?
Okay, so I first want to clarify something, which is that I see a role for both government and private business. As I was explaining, I think before, I think it's important that we have laws and regulations on climate pollution and set clear and dependable signals to the private sector about where to place their bets going forward in a world where it costs money to emit climate pollution. By the way, where it costs money to deplete aquifers and where it and pollute them and cause people health problems, etc. So that's one thing. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want to return to it, so you're not going to get up that easily, Avery.
Yeah. Oh no! Actually, let me get in on the demand side. So I do not think that it's the business of government to regulate what people eat. I think it is very important to make it easy for people to make good choices, and that does come from government. But that's not about limiting choice. It's actually about increasing choice to include the option to eat healthy food.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So you raised the issue of innovation, which I want to share here with, maybe turn to Jeff here. Is there room for innovation on sequestering carbon, or are there other ways that we're talking about innovation, such as alternative meat products, that kind of thing? So all of you have talked about innovation. Where does the rubber hit the road for you? I know that from the Carbon Cycle Institute, you think there's probably room for innovation on sequestering carbon. But could you talk about, maybe all of you talk about innovation now?
Sure. Well, one of the our focus, Carbon Cycle Institute, is working with producers, but also working with this structure we call resource conservation districts, or I think in New York there might be soil and water conservation districts. They exist across the United States. They were created during the Dust Bowl in response to the last ecological catastrophe we faced as a nation. They were very effective for a while. They've become somewhat moribund. Our work right now is focusing on activating those institutions in order to get access to a more global coverage of farmers in the United States. And the idea is to provide the kind of information producers might need to make a switch toward a more climate-focused or carbon-focused agriculture. We've ignored carbon in our agricultural production system. We've taken it for granted because we could, because it's invisible. And yet all of our agriculture is totally dependent on carbon capture from the atmosphere. So bringing that understanding and awareness to our producers is really our focus. And what we're seeing is that as the penny drops for a producer and they begin to understand the centrality of carbon in their production cycle, they begin to make changes in how they manage their landscape that just inevitably have a climate benefit, or at least an improvement over what they've been doing in the past. So that's where we're focusing on.
What's the ceiling on the potential for that innovation? Nicolette was talking about 5 times the kind of production on current land if we incorporate regenerative.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Well, we're always constrained by the physical reality of how much solar energy falls on a piece of land, and then how much water is available to support that photosynthetic capture. So it is a very site-specific question.
Yeah.
Including the soils, of course, which are obviously highly diverse, and even within a farm can be highly diverse. So it comes down to very specific management for very specific objectives. But I think the kinds of increases that Gabe Brown has shown and others show the potential, at least on some farms. I'm not going to say that's going to happen everywhere.
So that's contingent on soil, climate, geography. What are you in fact, Sara, you talked about the Ogallala aquifer and changing the practices there, but do you see that innovation is contingent on where these innovations are taking place?
Yeah, so I think that comes back to that question of scale that was brought up right at the beginning, and that conversation this morning of different scales. And I think that's absolutely true when we talk about land use. Like, it is a piece of land is not a piece of land, it's not a piece of land, right? It's not all interchangeable. And I think, unfortunately, we talk about it like that, and that again, divorces it from the reality of, like, the on-the-ground decisions that are made about why land is managed in a given way. I think there's definitely that potential. You know, I think one of the challenges is like in my previous role, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association, we did a life cycle assessment or an environmental footprinting exercise of U.S. beef, and we actually just assumed carbon neutrality on all soils, right? Like, there's no carbon being sequestered because we don't have a good nationwide database, right, of actual empirical data that you could support any sort of claim, right? That doesn't mean that it's not happening in certain locations, but to be conservative, you can't make that claim, right? So, you know, my ideal world is like we'd have a nationwide network of flux towers and actual gas measurements where we could get, you know, CO2 and nitrous oxide emissions and water fluxes from all these acres, right? That would help us understand that a lot, right? So we just need a slight amount of money to go into that, right? But that would be very helpful in terms of driving this discussion, because I think that's part of the challenge is that sometimes it's like you need more empirical data. We have these excellent case studies of certain locations where people are doing things, but we can't, of course, extrapolate that everywhere.
Where should that empirical data come from? Who should be driving it? Should it be the industry? Should we trust the industry to drive it, or should we have? Should there be a public presence? Should USDA do more? Who should be driving?
So I mean, ideally, it would be public, right? I mean, I'm a product of land grant universities and spent 4 years on faculty, and I'm a big believer in like that mission, right? And we should be funding those universities more and create that ability to have that type of system out there. But of course, when we look at actual agricultural funding for research or for these type of projects, it's been going down in real dollars, right? And so I think that's always the disconnect too, is again, we talk about these things, but it's like, you know, it's kind of like the show me the money, right? Like,
right.
If we actually cared in this stuff from a public standpoint, then why aren't we investing in it from a public standpoint?
So
There's some sites, I don't want to discount, like USDA has the LTAR network, the long-term Agroecosystem research network that is trying to do some of that, but it's not at the scale that
Yeah.
is.
Avery, want to jump in?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. This vision of flux towers everywhere is one that's really near and dear to my heart too. But it's probably because I'm also a wonky guy and a land grant guy. Look, there's some really great points that Sarah's made there. We have success stories of innovation of the type she's describing. I think of the ability of Descartes Labs, which is a startup out of Los Alamos Laboratory. It's a for-profit startup that uses satellite data from NASA and ag yield data that's collected through the shoe leather of USDA to predict in near real-time crop yields in corn and soybeans in the Midwest, and is helping us to reduce the amount of inputs that we need from both fertilizer and pesticides in those cropland areas. It's a story about how a public investment in data infrastructure combined with a public investment in the sort of data science that was happening at Los Alamos led to a lot of value for the private sector. And it's a great example of how the government can have a role to play in terms of crowding in private investment in land and in the agricultural sector. And I think that that's a big part of the innovation puzzle. If I might just pull back and talk about innovation,
Yeah.
I think there's the what, and it's sort of an across-the-board thing. It's from our farm fields and our pastures all the way to our plates and everything in between. It's all protein, it's soil carbon, it's this sort of precision agriculture infrastructure. It's both the public and private sector, and oftentimes working synergistically, making sure that public investments crowd in rather than crowd out the private investments. And I think the how is the hard part, right? We so far have lacked a political will for this. It looks like it's starting to change. I thought it was really encouraging to see Secretary Perdue, the Agriculture Secretary, break from the rest of the cabinet and the Trump administration and call for a price on carbon. Really remarkable that it's the only cabinet member calling for that. There are a number of bills that are looking like they may make their way through the House that put a price on carbon in the agriculture sector, and those are the sorts of things that can begin to drive some of these changes that we really need to see.
Yeah, so that innovation, I'm glad you brought that up. We did this in electronic communication. And one of the things that you argued, an innovation that you're sort of suggesting here is passing on the true cost of how we're farming to the food that we're eating. And I went back to you and said, and we'll say this now for us to talk about, is how does that perhaps exacerbate problems of accessibility to food if a Wendy's burger is twice as much, and working families and communities of color and urban communities are dependent on that? Do we exacerbate maybe inadvertently these challenges, and how do we meet those social consequences of passing on true cost?
Yeah, so thanks for bringing it up. This is such a brutally difficult issue when it comes to food. I'll start with my first principle, which is we need to know the true cost of our food. If we don't measure it, we can never hope to manage it. But then once we do measure it, oftentimes what we'll see is that passing on that true cost, we can expect that it'll affect the behavior of only the poorest consumers, and that's not a good situation. So I think that the goal in measuring the true cost is to design kind of our priorities and make our priorities about how to innovate to reduce those costs, reduce those harms. But I think simply passing those costs on to consumers is unlikely to move the needle much in terms of shifting demand. And to the extent that it does, it's likely to be incredibly regressive and inappropriate.
I think this is an important issue for Jeff or Sara to weigh in. So what would you say? Either one.
We, in our work with producers, one of the things we've heard a number of times, and I think it holds true, is if you want me to sequester carbon, I need to get paid for that. You're asking me to change my practices. You're asking me to do something different. So pay me to do it, and I'll do it. Farmers are great at overproducing. We'll be happy to do that, but we've got to get paid for it. And I'd love to see that. I'd love to see a real price on carbon that would enable producers to actually realize some economic return from that effort. And I think we would see an enormous social benefit from that in terms of soil quality improvements, water quality improvements, production improvements, reduced costs. California has 600 square miles of undrinkable groundwater because of excessive nitrogen fertilizer use. Things like this that are not currently being accounted for that we could address in a much more multidimensional framework if we recognize this critical nexus between our climate crisis and our food.
So you're talking about a subsidization, subsidizing that healthy burger as opposed to allowing the free market
Well,
to
you could
continue.
you could see it as a subsidy, or you could see it as a price on this ecosystem service that the producer is providing. So we're primarily relying on models to measure the increases in carbon in our agricultural systems because of the difficulties of trying to directly measure carbon change on the landscape scale. A network of flux towers nationally would be very interesting.
Consensus view.
So I think this is a good discussion, and really comes down to, of course, it's bigger than carbon too, and I think that's part of the challenge. Is like ultimately what this whole thing is about, and why it's so contentious is we're talking about total social costs versus total social benefits, and there's a whole bunch of value judgments chalked in there too, right? So it's not perfectly objective, any of these conversations, not even close to objective, not even perfectly, but so I think that's part of the challenge too. Is like if we were to do that. How do you value some of these other aspects? This is where I think, especially ruminant meat production, like it does take more pounds of dry matter. Like ruminants are ruminants, so they're going to belch methane. Like there are some of these biological realities, but then there's all these positives of ruminant production, and that was kind of came out in the discussion this morning of like we don't have a very good way of weighing those two things, right? Or measuring a lot of these things. So it comes back to Avery's comment about private investment. We're already, I'll just share no names, but I know there's lots of cattle feeders that are already getting these questions from investors, from banks. Okay, like what's your outcomes of all these carbon emissions and stuff? And they're like, I don't know, man. I just feed cattle, right? They don't know what their emissions are, right? So it's like, I think that's part of this reality check that has to come in too. It's like we want to manage these systems, but we don't have good measurements for these folks to use currently. So it's like it's the unsexy part of it, but it's like first you got to start with that, right? Like building systems that are credible, transparent to document some of these things. And I strongly believe when some of these folks are actually measuring it and tracking it over time, they will have incentives to pull levers to try to reduce some of these impacts, right? The unintended negative impacts that they're currently not documenting.
Those incentives. No, let Avery go. You want to say
Just one quick
We'll
point.
get that.
Yeah, just wanted to double down on this notion that carbon sequestration or climate emissions associated with food and ag are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to both the costs and the benefits associated with the food system. There was an excellent recent report called Growing Better by the Food and Land Use Coalition that calculated that globally, annually, the revenue from agriculture is $10 trillion. And the negative externalities from agriculture and the food system were $12 trillion, greater than that revenue. And of that 12 trillion, a little less than 2 trillion were the climate harm. Most of the rest of it was health. And we're talking, antibiotic resistant bacteria. We're talking heart disease. We're talking local water pollution. We're talking local air pollution. We're leaving out the coronavirus and other zoonotic diseases that can be incredibly damaging to our economy and sometimes do come from our food system. So I think what we need moving forward with respect to this stuff is to have a coalition of the willing who get together and say, we can do better. We're going to need to work together to do better. We're going to need to acknowledge that these problems are problems. We're going to need to acknowledge that the things we're doing are inadequate. We're going to need to acknowledge that there's a role to play for both business and government. And without that, I fear that we'll have a very difficult time addressing these problems.
So that's, you always anticipate the next question. We're talking about incentivizing change here. And part of what you just said was revealing the true cost, the social cost of how we're doing business right now. I worry, if you look at other revelations of social costs, it has not led to policy change. So we're now caging children on the border and separating families, and it has not changed the immigration policy. There might be a whole set of reasons why that has happened, but it hasn't moved our hearts, and it hasn't moved our policy. We've seen it in terms of health and the move towards comprehensive health care. So why do you believe that revealing these true social costs and true cost of the way we're producing food would result in a transformation?
Oh yeah, so I think that's necessary, but insufficient for transformation, just to be clear. Look, when we look at the various ways that climate touches all of us, actually food is something that's quite resonant with people compared to many other things. Energy and how we get it's quite wonky, but food, it's something that's deeply cultural, it's deeply personal, we all care about it, we think about it. It turns out to be a point of entry that leads people to engage in deeper thinking and sometimes action on climate. And I think that we can do more on that than we've been doing as a coalition of the willing to make change. So I think that you're right. These are issues that are not strictly technical. We need to understand that technical basis, but there's an emotional and kind of non-technical aspect to this we really do need to lead with when we're thinking about how to make a difference.
Yeah, a different way of asking that is to channel Nicolette's question of it's not the cow but the how. But I'm actually questioning, does the how really change behavior and change priorities in the industry? If we know the how, does it really result in the policy changes that we need?
I think there's been a lot of change in agriculture, right? And it is, as we said earlier, right? It's driven by where the market signals are currently, right? So I think there is potential for it's not just policy, but when these things are paid for, right? Like if it costs X amount of dollars to pull fossil carbon out of the ground, why don't we pay X amount of dollars to put it back in the ground, right? I mean that would, if the price of carbon was $200 or $300 a ton instead of 10, there'd be all sorts of change, right? People would be signing up, and there'd be a lot of changes happening. So I think that's the key thing is there just hasn't been the price there for that. I've totally random, but just to drive home, like things do change if there's a price signal, right? In the beef industry, this is really specific, but U.S. beef is mostly grain finished beef, but it's also driven by genetics. This is part of why our cattle herd looks the way it does. And there's, in the last 20 years, been a major shift in the U.S. cattle industry towards what we call higher USDA quality grade beef, right? So choice, prime beef, right? So that makes up over 70% of the U.S. beef supply now, whereas 15 years ago was like 50%, okay? So it's a massive shift in a short amount of time. And that's happened because there's been a price signal there for producers to change the genetics of their cattle, right? And that's what if you drive across Kansas now, you're going to see a whole bunch of black animals, right? Certified Angus beef and all these things have been drivers in the industry, right? And I think that's important to look at that. That's a major change in the industry that's happened relatively quickly because the price signal was there, right? That's more focused on customer eating experience, right? That does influence production practices. But that's where I don't think we should say, well, it's just not possible. It's just that, again, that's what we've prioritized, people's eating experience, which I appreciate, a better quality marbled steak, right? But that's where the money has gone.
Of course, the government has to play a role in certifying those different gradations, right?
Yeah,
and
so there's, exactly.
Yeah.
USDA provides oversight for that, so it's not just the Wild West, and there's actually standards for sure.
Yeah, so it gets into this question, and I don't want to leave this discussion and go to questions yet without bringing in the Green New Deal, right? What should be the priorities of, whether we call it the Green New Deal or we just call it government, setting the standards and perhaps shaping our consumption habits here? I hear you saying that it's about preference or choice of the buying public. Their consciousness has changed over time. So there's more consciousness to grass-fed beef and sustainably raised beef. But government, what role does government play in terms of shaping that and certifying what we eat and how we eat? So
I'll start with that. You have somebody that will cover this well in the afternoon, right? But in terms of, I think, there's a lot of discussion of consumption this morning, so I think it's good to kind of ground ourselves in like where some of the data is, right? And we ate the most beef in the United States back in like 1975, 76. We consumed like 3 ounces of beef per person per day after you adjust for all losses. We now consume 1.8 ounces, right? So it's not almost over 40% decline, right? And what's happened is that we're producing roughly the same, a little bit more beef as compared to the 70s with a lot fewer cattle. But of course, the U.S. population has grown by 100 million, right? So we're taking that beef and we're spreading it out over more plates, right? And what has supplanted the plate has been more chicken, right? So we're eating roughly the same amount of animal source foods as we did back then, but we just kind of mix it up in terms of what we are eating. And if you look globally, according to FAO data, the last 4 decades, beef per capita, or the actual production has increased less than population. So that means per capita availability is going down of beef in the world. I don't think people realize that, right? And I think there are supply side constraints that will make that reality, right? So I almost think like this whole discussion that gets very heated at times about how much we should eat. Quite frankly, I think the biology is going to sort that out, right? Like there isn't, we're just not going to eat that much more beef in the future, in my opinion, just the way the trend lines are going. Something may radically change, because that's obviously future projections may change, but some of those projections that are used in, for example, the WRI report, I looked at that last night, it's like 88% assumed increase from 2010 to 2050 of ruminant meat, of beef. And really the linear trend where we're headed is like 38%, So it's like, I feel like a lot of this argument that we get so fired up about is kind of like, whatever, it's kind of pointless because we'll be fine. It's like it comes back to the how. Like let's just focus on what we can control, which is not the individual choices of 326 million Americans or 7 billion people, right? Like think about it from that perspective. Can you control that many people, or how about a much smaller group of decision makers that actually produce food, right? Even just look at it practically like that. I think I'd take the smaller group, right, if you want to influence change.
I got to weigh in on this one if it's okay. So I think I'll start with the last point first. We need so much out of our land, as Tim was saying earlier, and as Nicolette was saying earlier too. We need healthy food. We need food that's grown in regenerative systems. We need the sequestration of carbon. We need to feed people nutrients as they come onto the earth and become more affluent. And we can't possibly afford to increase per capita consumption of beef at the rate that might happen if we don't begin to regulate some of the unintended or hidden costs associated with it. We need to scale up regenerative. And I think I thought we got to a good place towards the end of the last panel. There's a lot of room for that. But I think we have to acknowledge that there is some danger of per capita beef consumption growing enough that it crowds out our ability to do other things with the land, and we need to do all those other things. I also wanted to get back to the point about price signals. One of the key ways that price signals can happen is actually when investors price in their expectations of companies, and I just don't think it's happening well enough in the agribusiness space as yet. I saw a recent report that shows that when you look at Tyson Foods across the 7 major different corporate social responsibility metrics for the food sector, they range from last to first and everything in between, depending on which metric you look at. We need to do better. That means that there is no price signal when it comes to investor expectations in Tyson Foods. And there needs to be a price signal for Tyson Foods. By the way, baked into those investor expectations are expectations about what future policies might look like in a world where the U.S. has an administration that re-enters the Paris Agreement, for example. And at the moment, when it comes to agribusiness, the picture is really muddled, and it can't be. There's no way that we'll get the innovation we need if that picture is not muddled. And then back to the role of government. Government has the ability to do its own R&D, and it's done it well in food. The 20th century food system has its problems, but government's role in that R&D was important. As we look towards what the 21st century food system needs to look like, we need a perspective that is holistic, that takes into consideration these health, environmental, and food considerations, and sets an R&D agenda that meets that challenge. And I think that's the sort of thing that is the role for government to play. Whether you call it the Green New Deal or something else, it's really important. And it can't happen without acknowledging that we have these multiple objectives, without acknowledging that those objectives may include not necessarily inducing an 88% increase in the consumption of beef, that we need something different, and that we need clean water, clean air, et cetera. When we do that stuff, I think we'll be in a better place.
So one of the things that's happened at our conference that had cows in the title said that we were allowed to do that. Here it's meat, and we've had chicken come in, right? And I want to give a fair amount of attention to this issue. And I want to go to Jeff, because I know you're working with sheep, or shepherds, that's what we call ourselves, I raise sheep. You're working with shepherds to maybe make some changes in terms of clothing, and to pass on those regenerative gains to those types of farmers. I also wonder about, just put it on the table, about the potential of chicken. And one last thing I think is really important to think about is the issue of animal welfare and cruelty, because it's pretty clear that chicken is probably the most cruel of the meat producers out there. And Tim actually cited the cruelty that's happening. So that's a lot to think about, but let's start with you about maybe what you're doing with shepherds in California and the West.
Right. So we work with all kinds of producers: beef, dairy, sheep, wool, chickens. We just get people where they are. And one of the great partnerships we have right now is with a group called Fibershed, fibershed.com. Check them out. Fantastic group of folks. And what they're doing is they're embedding, they're working with supply chains. So they're working with folks like North Face and Patagonia, who historically have purchased wool without much consideration about where it's coming from. And they're embedding this climate component into this. So we're working with producers to transform their farming operations so that they can actually, through a whole farm planning process we call carbon farm planning, can actually shift their operation to a net climate beneficial agriculture. And then the buyers are using that, obviously, to market that story. The producer's getting, in some cases, tenfold the price for their wool. And this supply chain is now sort of entering the public lexicon, I guess, or the public imagination, with the understanding that the idea of a climate beneficial agriculture is not a fantasy. It's actually something achievable. Not that it will be easy to transform our agriculture globally, but there is that potential. And so demonstrating that potential, I think, is driving a lot of interest and a lot of change. But it is tied to this market piece that is covering the cost of making these changes.
Maybe you want to take the chicken question before we move to the floor for questions.
I think we should add the pig question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And pigs, not ruminants, they're destructive too, I can tell you that.
And that a huge amount of the forest destruction in South America has to do with soy to feed pigs.
To the best of our abilities, we need to add up what we get out of the way we produce food and what we put into it. And contemplating both the money the producers make and also the costs and benefits to society, including if it makes us feel awful because of the suffering of those chickens. And when we do that math, we need to be therefore thinking about how to prioritize a food system that is getting us more for what we put into it than the one we have today. And so I think that framework is a different framework than simply saying which thing yields the best. I think it's a more holistic view that more holistic view can get us a lot of the way to solving this problem. It includes the deforestation and includes the animal welfare. And we need to put those targets up on the dartboard and say, this is where we want to go.
I just want to say it's not always that animal welfare and productivity are in conflict, right? There's often lots of times where they're very positively related, right? And I think that's important too, is that I think there's sometimes some shorthand of just, when we say efficiency around animal production, I think it makes some people feel icky, right? Because it's like an animal and it's, but a lot of these things are about improving outcomes that are related to the animal's welfare as well, right? And maintaining productivity, or again, as Avery just said, right, you got lots of outcomes you're shooting for and making sure we're actually prioritizing those outcomes. So I think that's what's key too, is that a lot of these opportunities to improve, we've been talking a lot about soil carbon and everything else, but a lot of it is the management of animals, right? Animal health, animal disease. We lose a tremendous amount of animals globally in terms of just to mortality, right? So that's a huge inefficiency in the system. It's also a big welfare cost, right? So there are those win-wins where we're doing better by the animals, we're doing better by the environment, because healthier animals in general tend to gain more efficiently, right? They're not expending a bunch of energy on their mortality or on morbidity, or obviously mortality is a total loss. So I think that's important to keep in mind too. But again, it comes back to priorities. I mean, obviously chickens aren't even covered by the Animal Welfare Act, right? They've been kind of, there's a chicken, right? We haven't really prioritized them.
Well, Tim raised the issue of like, what is healthy in a chicken? Healthy by a market standard is different from healthy by.
Yeah, we can get into the whole animal welfare, right? The 3 circles idea and 5
we will
freedoms
do
and all
that
that. But
after-
that's
We'll go to
another
the 4
discussion.
first.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to put my professor hat on for just a moment here, because I think that our very knowledgeable but wonky people have been using words like sequestration and carbon sequestration. We have a lot of students here. Not all of them have taken a course on agriculture and have not taken a course on carbon cycles. And I just want to make sure that the students all understand what the relationship is between carbon sequestration and good pasture management. And the one word you need to know is photosynthesis. Okay? That the way in which you sequester carbon is by having well-managed pasture that has more plants in it for a longer period of time, that have deeper roots, that fix carbon both in the soil and in the leaves. Okay, so when folks are talking about carbon sequestration up here, I just want to make sure that all the students know what we're talking about, that a well-managed regenerative system, whether it's for cows or for sheep, really involves making sure there's more plants out there with deeper roots that then preserve more water into that. It's better for water. And that when you have more plants with deeper roots, as a few of my ENV 100 students are here, they know that means that you slow the water down and the water cycle is healthier, and so on. So what you get are healthier cycles, biogeochemical cycles. So if you want to learn more about that, you can take some of the courses in the Environmental Studies and Science Department. So I just wanted to make sure that people knew what those things were. Now, I also want to bring up the fact that a number of the people here are students, and they don't have a lot of money. And so a number of the questions I've been getting are both, how do we manage to come up with a system like this that is, because I have a lot of students who would love to eat the way people are talking about here, but one can't afford it, right? And have to sort of fuel themselves. And then secondly, they are also concerned, some of the questions are about, how do we do this? And this is a question we had before, but we probably should talk about a little bit more. This idea, I thought Tim's idea about redistributing meat is kind of an interesting one. How do we say, okay, we're going to pretty much grow the same amount of meat, but we got to redistribute it? How do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that people who need more to eat more meat get access to it? And so And there's a relationship between our students who can't afford it and the questions of, how do we make it sort of more accessible to people who need more protein in general. So I think those are major questions that are coming up electronically right now.
On affordability, the problem is, as you're saying, it's very difficult, and it's not just a protein problem. Scientists from Tufts University and also the International Food Policy Research Institute recently published a report in which they sought to estimate country by country what it would cost for people to achieve what they call nutritional adequacy. That's to make sure that they get enough of all the micronutrients they need to have a healthy diet. And this report was really sobering because it found that if people were to eat even the cheapest nutritionally adequate diet they could get, more than 1 billion people would need to spend more than their entire income in order to get that. And something like 3 billion people would need to spend more than half of their income to get that. It's way worse in many places in the world than in the US, although it's bad in the US too. It's totally unacceptable. And it's one of the things that makes this work that we do on food systems so very difficult, because we do have these costs associated with the food system we have today, but we cannot pass them on to consumers who are struggling to get the nutrition they need.
I think the question really does kind of come back around to what I started with, which is much of this dilemma is a function of how we have structured our political economy. And I don't think we're going to solve the climate crisis or the food crisis within the paradigm that we are currently operating in. We need a major shift in our priorities and how we allocate resources, right? So why is it that in the allegedly wealthiest country in the world we have students who are food insecure? There's something terribly out of whack here.
Yes, and we've done a survey here of food insecurity among students, and it was a large percentage.
Well, I'm not, it's not that I'm surprised, it's that I'm
Concerned.
Appalled.
concerned, and I'm concerned about a country that is willing to prioritize weapons, et cetera, over actually seeing people well fed and housed, et cetera. So I think it's a broader question.
So can we have a healthy food system and a healthy environmental environment without higher wages?
I think that's the same question.
Okay.
How do we?
So I think that's the Green New Deal question too. Okay.
I would just say, I hope the students, first of all, take care of yourself, right? I always worry about this conversation turning into, another way to food shame people, right? How dare you eat that? You're a terrible person, right? And I think that's a social cost, too, that doesn't get talked about too much. And so, yeah, I think that's very important. And then this question that came up about, especially beef, the global beef market is so freaking complex, right? And I think it's super easy to say, well, we should just eat less and we should export it to sub-Saharan Africa, right? Well, that would be ideal. But there are so many economic realities and other realities that prevent that from being what's going to happen if we further reduce our consumption, right? So that was brought up, that we export to Japan. Yeah, we export to Japan and South Korea are one and two markets for beef exports. And a lot of the things that we export for beef is actually the stuff that Americans don't want to eat, like tongue, right? The big export to Japan is beef tongue because they like it. I don't think, us, that's where it gets into this complicated piece, right? Or what we export a lot to South Korea is short ribs, like Korean barbecue and stuff like that, right? And so these are higher income countries, and the way that the beef market is a single animal produces all these different products, and they go to who pays the highest amount, right? So if we don't eat less, is it going to go to the poor person? I think that's what's really important about this is there are those realities that sounds good, but I don't think that the way the markets are set up, that's what's going to happen, right? And you also have to think about if we did sell all our beef to lower income countries, would that actually support U.S. production? Because now U.S. producers are getting less money, right? So there's all these complexities that I think we just kind of gloss over, the deeper questions in all these conversations that don't really come out that much because we're kind of stuck at that argument level of we eat too much, we eat too little, and we don't get into why things look the way they do.
Right, and the ironies of if you increase wealth, you actually increase meat eating. But in order to have a healthy, be able to pay farmers, you have to actually have more wealth among consumers. So it's an irony that all of you are dealing with. I understand. So one of the things that also is we seem to be jumping around, which I think is a good thing, but is always a little bit confusing, is between we're going from the farm level, like we're talking about shepherds, and then we're talking about global issues. And the thing that keeps getting talked about is the carbon tax. So can we talk about sort of what would a carbon tax look like at the farm level? I mean, how could it work? And I know that Jeff's working on some.
Yeah.
And
we are working on that.
and you are working on this because they are doing this in California.
Well, no, we're talking about it in California.
Oh, okay.
Um,
So farmers are not getting paid to sequester carbon in California.
No. Farmers are being paid to implement practices which are known to sequester carbon, but they're not being paid for their carbon. And that would be a very different equation. If we had a real price, $100, $200 a ton, which is not actually as far-fetched as it may sound, because the low carbon fuel standard in California is paying almost $300 a ton for fuel reduction use. So if we had a real price on carbon, and I sort of set a bar at $100 a ton, that would really induce change in our agricultural ecosystem in California. Because right now, without that little bit of money that folks are getting from the Department of Food and Ag in California to implement practices, unless a farmer is already a convert, if you will, to carbon farming and understand its direct benefit to their operation, people are not talking or thinking about it. It's just not in the cards. Everybody's working on really thin margins. But that would transform the entire conversation. A $100 price on carbon would be transformative in California, absolutely.
But what would that mean? I mean, how did that work at the farm level?
Well,
How would that work?
so we're, again, as I said, we're using models to evaluate what these various practices are achieving. So our one vision we have is for our resource conservation districts to act as carbon brokers. So these are county-based, county-level entities which have direct communication with
So who's paying the tax?
So that would presumably be coming from well, ideally it would be coming from the federal government. I mean,
Okay.
that's where it ideally would come from. There is no such source at this point.
Okay.
The state's not paying it, and the feds certainly aren't. California
But
could.
how would the money get into the federal government? One of the things I've been working on is how do you pay for sustainability?
Sure.
So where does the money, where does the money come from and where does it go and how does it get down into the farmer's pocket for doing these practices?
Well, for example, we have a cap and trade system in California.
Yeah.
Certain industries are regulated and do pay into this fund.
So if you had a power plant that was emitting carbon,
Yes.
they would have to pay for that. And they would probably pass that along to electricity customers. It's not something you'd get paid, you wouldn't pay for your more for your hamburger. You'd pay for the things that are paying for the sequestering of carbon at the farm level, right? So the price point here is not a price point where we're paying more for hamburger in order to sequester carbon,
Well,
right?
It depends.
Okay.
It depends entirely on what happens next, right? Whether the producers pass along their costs or gains from the carbon price to customers. And in the case of a hamburger, it could well be that it would get more expensive if there's a price on carbon that includes the agricultural sector. In other cases, it might go down if it's a situation like Nicolette's described, where we see measurable carbon sequestration on a farm where that farm is actually carbon negative.
Okay, so
But
we'd be
at the end-
balancing out the methane and the carbon, and possibly, right?
We're talking about two different approaches here, though.
Right.
Because you're talking about taxing farmers for the carbon they're emitting, and I'm talking about paying farmers for the carbon they're sequestering.
Right.
They could be the same thing. They could be running through the same process or not.
Yeah.
And we
Okay, for our students, the methane and carbon are both greenhouse gases. Okay. Just want to make sure everybody knows. Okay, so there's one more question. Oh, a lot of people are asking, how do we get there in different ways in these questions? One question is, where do I find this great meat? And if it's not accessible, how do we, what do we do about that? Other folks are asking, is it the fact that people don't care, right? Is it a policy question of a constituency question? Is it because the government doesn't care? Is it because people don't care? Is it because people can't find it? Is it because people can't pay for it? So these are all the different questions I'm seeing here, because folks want to know where we go with which of these issues are the issue, or all of the above.
So I come back to if you're gonna change things in a larger way, it has to be across the entire commodity, right? It can't just be small pockets of production. I think that will still be there, and there will be those folks that can afford that seek that out, and I think that's good, right? That differentiation. But I think the bigger opportunity for change is changing, again, outcomes across all of production, right? We have unintendedly made some things better in our system, right, that just, again, as a byproduct of efficiencies. But I go back to what I was saying earlier. We're getting people asking a lot of questions right now. I personally feel like, especially the U.S. beef industry is right on the cusp of there's going to be a lot of changes in the next decade in terms of monitoring some of these things, documenting them, reporting them out. I think that's going to change big time because there's the pressure there, because there's a lot of these net zero goals that are coming out from different companies, and quite frankly, a lot of these companies say we're going to do it, and by X year, we have no idea how the heck we're going to do it. So then falls on the people in the supply chain, aka the farmers, to figure it out, right? So I think there's going to be a lot of change, again, that's going to affect the beef that you would roll out to the grocery store and just buy. It may never translate into a carbon label. Maybe we'll get to that point, but we don't have that kind of traceability and data transfer system currently to facilitate such a thing.
So I get the feeling, Sara, that your argument, and it's an argument a number of people make, is that if we could do a little bit more in the conventional sector, we would make a bigger difference than but to give Jeff's example of working one-on-one with farmers, or are both necessary?
I think both are necessary, right? And I think those case study examples are really important in terms of showing what's possible, right? But at the same time, conventional production is not going to go away, but we do, say that genuinely. We have a lot of large feedlot operators that they're seriously looking at this stuff, right? They are incorporating grazing in their.
So are they listening to folks
They are.
Okay.
They're experimenting with some of these things, and I think that's what's cool is that we're seeing some of those changes. And if we have both those smaller case studies and then we have bigger operators that move, that'll move the whole industry.
That's a really hopeful idea. For those of you who have been in my sustainability class, we talk about prefiguration, how a small group or a small niche group of people come up with innovative ways of doing things and how that can move into the conventional system. And so we can think of Jeff Creque's sort of as a sort of group of niche farmers who are trying new things. Sara's in the group that's the conventional group who's listening to the Jeffs of the world. And it seems like Avery is thinking about how this could fit into how to invest in this new kind of. Is this correct?
Yeah, I see all of the above here. I think there seems to be this tendency to pit these different solutions against each other. I'm not sure where it comes from, but it's hugely unproductive. We need all of the above, and we need it yesterday.
I think it's called social media.
Potentially, yeah. Yeah, but we need all the above. We need it yesterday. It comes on both the supply side in the form of innovative ways of pasture-based farming, and also on the supply side in the form of cleaning up the emissions from large-scale facilities. And it comes on the demand side, too, in the form of helping people make good choices and also innovating to get food to our plates in new ways that are both healthy and good for the environment.
Well, great. Thank you very much.